Falcon Rising tells the narrative of John Falcon Chapman, a U.S. Marine Corps soldier suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder after witnessing all of his companions die in the battle. As a result, he frequently plays Russian roulette. Fortunately, his suicide attempts are never successful since, when the trigger is pushed, the gun does not shoot a bullet. One afternoon, Chapman was in a convenience shop when two burglars entered. Chapman was not afraid, and he encouraged the robbers not to point their weapons at the victim's stomach, because this would keep her alive. Chapman bravely held the rifle to his stomach and pointed it at his head. While the robbers were confused by his movements, Chapman struck one of them unconscious with the tip of his gun. Then he struck the second robber, knocking him unconscious. The next morning, when Chapman was recovering at home, his sister Cindy paid him a visit because she was heading to a friend's wedding in his hometown. She would then travel to Brazil to work as a humanitarian activist for a non-profit organization. Who would have thought? Cindy returned to Brazil, and Chapman learned that she had been discovered by the beach, dying from horrific injuries all over her body. Chapman immediately rushed to Brazil to examine Cindy's condition. In Brazil, a detective named Diego Santo and his partner Carlo Baroro are in a slum community arresting many locals accused of transporting illicit firearms. During his arrest, Santo was visited by a police officer named Catarina. She objected to Santo acting in her designated region. Furthermore, Santo treated citizens brutally. When one of the local youngsters noticed Santo intimidating Catarina, he threw a stone at his back. Santo reacted by pulling out his revolver and pointing it at the young man. The youths assembled there all pointed their rifles at Santo. Due to the urgency of the situation, Santo took preventive precautions by lowering his gun and challenging one of the kids to a fight with the condition that if he lost, he and his men would not return to that location. The residents of the favela approved Santo's challenge. Baroro went first, fighting with one of the favela gangsters. Aurora easily defeated the thug due to his capoeira skills. With a few kicks, Baroro knocked his opponent down. Santo shouted loudly as he witnessed his men's win, promising to return to the favela one day. The local youngsters regarded him critically. Returning to Chapman, who had arrived in Brazil, he was met by Manny Ridley, a fellow soldier and diplomat. Then Chapman went straight to Cindy, who was being treated in the intensive care unit. Chapman was surprised to witness Cindy's helpless state. Flashbacks to the anguish of the victims he had witnessed while serving in the battle zone flashed in his head. At the hospital, Ridley introduced Chapman to Santo, who was in charge of Cindy's assault case. Ridley persuaded Chapman to be calm and leave everything to Santo. However, Chapman insisted on being part of the probe. He requested Santo to accompany him to the crime scene where Cindy was discovered. When Chapman got at his location, he met Catarina. Chapman quickly grabbed the revolver buried beneath Catarina's waistband and aimed it toward an automobile. He heard an explosion from the car's exhaust. Santo recognized Chapman's movements as unusual and requested that Catarina keep a watch on him. Catarina then showed Chapman around the slum and explained who lived there. Catarina pointed out that many public facilities, including health clinics, schools, and government offices, were funded by illegal businesses. Citizens were obliged to do this because the government ignored them. This presents a quandary for Catarina, who works in law enforcement. If she apprehends drug traffickers, smugglers, and criminals, the people of the slum will suffer. After showing Chapman around the slum, Catarina left him alone on the beach. Chapman, who was inquisitive, returned to the crime scene and observed his surroundings from a distance. He noticed a gathering of suspicious young folks and followed them. He was astonished to see Cindy's necklace wrapped around the neck of one of the adolescents named Kuka. Chapman inquired about the necklace's origin. Kuka, who couldn't speak English, didn't respond to Chapman's query and instead made a gesture to challenge him to a fight. The conflict was unavoidable. Chapman was ganged up by several young people. Chapman fought them one by one, using just his bare fists. Even when Kuka struck with a knife, Chapman effortlessly broke through and took the weapon. He then pointed the knife back at Kuka. Catarina appeared unexpectedly, pointing a gun, prompting Chapman to lower the knife he had put on Kuka's neck. Catarina interpreted Kuka's statements and informed Chapman that he was one of Cindy's pals. While exhibiting his sister's photo with Cindy, Kuka stated that Cindy had presented the necklace to his younger sister directly. However, his younger sister had vanished before Cindy was discovered severely injured on the beach. As a result, it is reasonable to believe that the criminal who attacked Cindy was also responsible for the kidnapping of Kuka's sister. Before Chapman left, Kuka gave him Cindy's notepad, which had been entrusted to his sister. Kuka anticipated that the notepad would include information to help him discover the offender. That afternoon, after analyzing the notebook with carbon paper, Chapman discovered the phone number of a photographer who had just worked with Cindy. The next day, Chapman confronted the photographer in a cafe. Cindy, according to the photographer, was researching a human trafficking scheme. When the photographer declined to offer evidence of Cindy's assault, Chapman covertly stole the photographer's flash drive as he said goodbye. However, when the photographer entered his car, the vehicle detonated. The unfortunate photographer died in the explosion. Worst, a car suddenly pulled to a stop in front of the cafe, and the persons inside fired shots at Chapman. Fortunately, Chapman was able to evade. He seized a gun from one of the armed invaders and returned fire with pinpoint accuracy, forcing them to leave. Not long later, Chapman was in Ridley's office, inspecting the photographer's flash drive. The flash drive contained images of Cindy with a man in a nightclub, which were said to be related to Cindy's attack. When Ridley saw the name of the nightclub, he was reminded of a gang of Yakuza who had resided in Brazil for 30 years. The Yakuza are vicious gangsters that frequently kidnap children. Cindy most likely was aware of the situation and conducted her own inquiry. When they uncovered Cindy's inquiry, they taught her a lesson. That night, Chapman went to a nightclub and met the man he was looking for. Chapman chased the man to the toilet and attacked him, pushing his head into the toilet. After lying useless, the man finally gave in and provided Chapman the address of the person who had hurt Cindy. The next afternoon, Chapman and Ridley went to the address. Meanwhile, Santo and his fellow police officers are planning a large-scale raid on a favela residential neighborhood to arrest drug dealers. The attack started indiscriminately. The police quickly shot and killed any adolescents who attempted to flee their pursuit. All of the youths were slain in the ambush, and Santo provided no notice before it began. One of Santo's men, who was still strolling around the settlement's corner, happened to notice numerous Japanese guys in black suits carrying youngsters. Suspicious, he arrested the Japanese men. A few moments later, Santo approached him. Who would have thought? Santo instantly killed his man and allowed the Japanese men to depart the favela. Santo is shown to be a corrupt police officer who collaborates with the Yakuza, allowing the Yakuza to continue their illegal activities openly. Worse, Santo blamed the teenagers of the favela for the Yakuza group's criminal deeds. Meanwhile, Chapman had reached his target. He instructed Ridley to go home because he was going to inspect the place alone. It turned out that the location he arrived at was the Yakuza headquarters, but he entered fearlessly and defeated the Yakuza he encountered. Chapman was soon ganged up by 3 Yakuza and forced to fight unarmed. The noise alarmed one of the Yakuza members stationed at the site. He quickly phoned Hiramoto, the Yakuza's leader. Elsewhere, the bald Hiramoto is seen sitting in a big courtyard. He had just hung up and approached a visiting guest. Then, one of his soldiers carried a long box carrying a blade. Hiramoto moved slowly towards the man Chapman had met in the nightclub, his face placid and expressionless. Hiramoto stabbed the poor man in the stomach, killing him instantly. Chapman is still fighting in the Yakuza group's headquarters. Suddenly, Santo and Baroro aimed their weapons at Chapman and told him to cease attacking the Yakuza. Chapman presented them a bag containing paperwork on human trafficking cases as evidence of the Yakuza's activities. As he prepared to depart, Chapman realized that Santo had made a mistake by including Mr. Lima's name on the list of documents he had given him. Chapman had not before disclosed Mr. Lima's name. Chapman went back and hid in Santo's car. As it turned out, Santo was driving his automobile away from the Yakuza headquarters towards a pier. Chapman managed to jump out of Santo's car and hide while keeping an eye on Santo's actions from a distance. At the pier, Santo goes to a warehouse where the Yakuza hide the youngsters they've stolen. Chapman immediately called Ridley and sought the police for assistance in stopping the smuggling of these tiny infants. Chapman, impatient for Ridley and the police to arrive, decided to go inside alone. While trying to get out of sight, Chapman assaulted them one by one, successfully immobilizing numerous Yakuza members. Chapman then ran into Baroro, who quickly assaulted him with the capoeira martial art technique. But his capoeira was ineffective against Chapman, who knocked Aurora to the ground with a powerful blow. Then Santo arrived, but it turned out he lacked good martial arts ability. Chapman can easily break through Santo's attacks, but Baroro got back up, and he and Santo joined forces against Chapman. As if it wasn't enough, Hiramoto assisted them in fighting Chapman with his samurai sword. However, Santo and Baruro are vulnerable to Chapman's might, even used his bare hands. Next, Chapman attacked Hiramoto, but because Hiramoto used a sword, Chapman used 2 iron rods to assault him. Their combat was brief. Chapman easily defeated Hiramoto, who collapsed after being hit by iron. It wasn't long until Ridley and the police arrived at the docks, while Chapman attempted to release the youngsters. At the end of the film, Chapman encounters another dilemma. Healing Cindy's internal wounds will be extremely expensive. Fortunately, Ridley is ready to assist pay for Cindy's therapy on the condition that Chapman join the State Department as an agent under the nickname Falcon, which he used while serving in the military. Chapman had no choice but to accept the offer. The film ends.